opens diagonals for queen and bishop, immediately contesting the center and dictating early play. Mirroring the central pawn instantly unlocks symmetrical play, a dance of equal ambition for the open space. Instantly targeting black's central pawn, this knight development prepares for castling and seeks to dictate the early pawn structure. Developing the knight to its most natural square reinforces the central pawn and prepares for kingside castling. Introducing immediate pressure on the knight, this bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines toward the king. Gambiting space now risks opening up lines for your king later. Retreating the bishop preserves the tension, keeping black's queenside development options slightly restricted while maintaining a passive pin. Developing a knight here challenges white's central pawn and prepares for castling. Securing the monarch is paramount. This timely castling prepares for central engagement and shields the king. An ambitious gambit sacrificing a pawn for immediate central disruption, hoping to exploit the exposed king. Opening the center with d4 immediately challenges black's adventurous knight and seeks to gain central space, preparing for rapid piece development and potential king safety issues for black if not handled precisely. Black bravely grabs more space in the center with this pawn thrust, though it does open up the queenside and might invite future pressure. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal control after the pawn advance reclaims crucial piece activity, keeping options open for future pawn pushes or supporting a knight outpost. Black liberates the pawn structure, initiating a dynamic sequence that could lead to complex central struggles and a potential pawn majority for white in the center if black isn't careful with subsequent piece development. Recapturing with the rook on the open file immediately pressures black's central pawn and prepares to challenge for control of the e-file, hinting at a positional squeeze rather than an immediate tactical skirmish. Challenging white's central occupation, this maneuver directly confronts the pawn on e4 and aims to liberate black's position, potentially opening lines for active piece play and creating pawn majority ambitions on the queenside if white's response is passive. Developing the knight to its natural square here not only bolsters the central pawn chain, but also prepares to contest the e5 square, a key battlefield where black's advanced pawn currently exerts significant influence. This knight's presence on c3 is a prerequisite for potential future advances, like c4, which could begin to pry open lines against black's queenside structure and create dynamical imbalances. It's a move that subtly reinforces white's ambition for central control and future kingside action. Developing the bishop to a central outpost offers a strong defensive shield for the kingside and prepares to contest the d-file, aiming to alleviate pressure and potentially launch counterplay. Sacrificing the knight opens up a fascinating tactical tangle, forcing black to confront the immediate pawn threat on e4 and the potential for white's rooks to become active. This bold exchange shifts the game's character dramatically, demanding precise calculation and a keen eye for counterplay in the center. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the diagonal for your bishop and allows your pieces to develop more harmoniously, preparing for potential kingside advances while solidifying your central presence. Retrieving the rook from its exposed prior position, this maneuver immediately pressures black's central pawn and sets up a potential battery on the e-file, aiming to exploit the dark squares around the black king. Developing the bishop to a more active square, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for castling, finally brings this piece out of its starting shell. Unlocking the c-file for rook activity and creating a clear pathway to black's now somewhat exposed king structure marks the primary objective of this exchange, aiming to disrupt white's pawn formation and create long-term weaknesses. Sacrificing pawn structure for king safety is often a shrewd gamble, and here, black accepts the doubled e pawns in exchange for removing the immediate threat to their monarch. Finally, white captures the central pawn with the knight, aiming to solidify their piece presence and potentially open lines. This bold recapture disrupts black's pawn structure and immediately injects dynamic tension into the position, forcing black to address the immediate threat and potentially commit their pieces further. Repositioning the king to safety is a logical priority after the recent exchange, aiming to consolidate black's position. White boldly confronts black's king, initiating an immediate assault aimed at its shelter, turning a seemingly calm position into a sharp tactical battlefield. Seeking immediate simplification and aiming to relieve the pressure on the king's side, black opts to trade off white's active knight. This sequence aims to neutralize white's central pawn majority and transition towards a more balanced middle game, though it also grants white a slightly more open position. Reclaiming the rook reestablishes piece presence on the open d-file, aiming to disrupt black's nascent kingside attacking formation and recover the pawn sacrificed earlier in the exchange. Initiating a counter-battery by repositioning the queen, black aims to disrupt white's central dominance and potentially exploit the open files that have emerged, a subtle shift from the prior skirmish to a more strategic maneuvering phase. The rook now retreats, repositioning from the exposed d-file to a more secure, central square, and crucially it prepares to join the queenside skirmish by eyeing the open e-file should the opportunity arise, while simultaneously providing a defensive screen for white's king. Shifting the rook to f6, black aims to re-establish central control and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also keeping a watchful eye on the now open f-file. Suddenly the bishop arrives, aiming its gaze directly at the d4 pawn and creating a newfound pressure point that demands black's immediate attention, potentially disrupting their carefully built pawn structure and forcing defensive concessions as the game pivots towards an open center with multiple targets. Shifting the queen to d7 provides valuable support for the e4 pawn, a crucial defensive point, while also preparing for potential future counterplay along the d-file, potentially challenging white's central pawn presence. Stepping onto the d-file now allows white to actively contest black's central control and threaten to disrupt their queenside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the king. The queen boldly ventures into the center, seeking active play and challenging white's central control, though it momentarily exposes itself to potential attacks from the bishop and knight. Reclaiming central influence, the bishop fortifies the queen's side, anticipating potential pawn advances and creating a defensive wall against black's aggressive intentions. Bringing the rook into the game this way is a bold, if somewhat desperate, attempt to stir up counterplay, repositioning a piece that was becoming a bit of a spectator. Shifting the queen to e2 repositions the attacker, aiming to create pressure along the newly opened diagonal towards black's castled king, and eyeing potential sacrifices on the g6 pawn to expose its defenses, all while preparing to swing the rooks into more active central positions. Black seeks to contest the d-file, acknowledging white's dominance there after the rook exchange. This maneuver simultaneously prepares to support potential pawn advances in the center and might even pose a threat to white's isolated d-pawn in the long run, aiming for a more balanced pawn structure. Fortifying the kingside becomes paramount, creating a robust defensive shell and preparing to potentially launch a pawn storm or shift operations towards the center. Black's qd5 seizes the open d-file, a bold challenge that immediately puts pressure on white's rook and queen. This maneuver skillfully redirects the queen to a more active central square, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially launch an offensive against the white king's defenses. It also hints at a desire to trade queens, which might simplify the position and lead to an endgame where black's passed pawn on d5 becomes a significant asset. A shift towards solidifying white's central pawn structure, aiming to free the rook from its defensive task and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or a regrouping maneuver. Unlocking the c-file and challenging white's central pawn structure, this advance disrupts the otherwise static pawn formation and creates immediate dynamic possibilities for black's queen and rook. Clearing the path for potential central pawn advances, this maneuver repositions the bishop to a more active square, creating a strong diagonal aimed at black's queenside. Attempting to untangle the knight and bolster the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver brings the rook to a more active square, potentially eyeing the d4 outpost and preparing to challenge white's central control through a pawn advance. A bold repositioning, the bishop abandons its pin on the d-file to seek a more active outpost, aiming to restrict black's queen and potentially support a kingside advance. Or perhaps more accurately, white is setting a subtle trap, daring black to overextend on the queenside while white consolidates and prepares for a central thrust. Consider the diagonal this bishop now commands. It casts a long shadow over black's kingside, hinting at future threats that might bypass the immediate pawn structure. This maneuver, seemingly innocuous, reshapes the board's dynamics, creating new lines of attack and forcing black to reevaluate their defensive posture. It's a patient build-up, this shift of a key attacking piece, suggesting white isn't rushed and is willing to wait for the perfect moment to exploit black's slightly loose structure. A crucial moment arises as black consolidates their position, aiming to redeploy their rook to a more active square. This repositioning attempts to challenge the long-term control white's bishop has exerted from c3, subtly preparing for a potential skirmish on the d-file. It's a defensive maneuver, certainly, but one that hints at future counterplay, seeking to avoid the sort of static vulnerability that can arise when pieces are passively observing. Black is essentially saying, "I see your pressure, and I'm not going to let it suffocate me." The idea is to create options, even if they are modest, and to avoid a purely reactive posture. Suddenly, white re-anchors the bishop to a more dynamic diagonal, disrupting black's piece coordination and eyeing the weakened kingside. Exploiting the open c-file, black surges forward, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially chain pawns for a powerful passed pawn. An unexpected tactical breakthrough. This exchange sacrifices the rook to immediately exploit the exposed black king and disrupt the coordination of black's pieces. Finally, a decisive exchange that reshapes the battlefield, gifting your king a much-needed respite from the relentless pressure white has been applying along the open files. Unleashing a decisive discovered check, this queen sacrifice rips open the position and forces a king walk, strategically aimed at disrupting black's pawn structure and exposing weaknesses on the queen side. Sacrificing the queen here is forced. Clinging to it would lead to immediate material loss, with the rook attacking the queen and the bishop supporting it. The immediate aftermath of the queen exchange reveals a distinct advantage for white. The rooks now dominate open lines and white's king remains remarkably secure, while black's monarch might soon feel the chill of an exposed position. Recognizing the precariousness of the isolated doubled pawns, black prioritizes defending them by bringing the bishop into a more active role, aiming to support the e-pawn and potentially prepare for future pawn advances. Securing the rook on the open file after the exchange of queens initiates a sharp endgame where white must now relentlessly convert their material advantage by actively using the remaining pieces. Exploiting the open file with king confrontation and threatening the rook's safety, this move aggressively challenges white's centralized position. A calm retreat, safeguarding the monarch from the immediate checks and establishing a secure stronghold for the final stage of the battle. Unbalancing the material by seizing that bishop might seem tempting, but it opens a dangerous avenue for white's rook to become a dominant force on the open d-file, potentially leading to a swift checkmate. Asserting control over the open file with the rook offers a potent way to disrupt black's pawn structure and create threats against the vulnerable king. The rook's activation to the first rank, a seemingly aggressive thrust, now faces the stark reality of white's pawn structure consolidation, leaving it isolated and vulnerable to being cornered by the advancing pawns. The rook now secures the 7th rank, preventing black's pawns from advancing further and solidifying white's material advantage after the recent exchanges. Securing the initiative, black diversifies pawn pressure, aiming to exploit the open rank for immediate counterplay. Seizing control of the open file now offers a clear path to disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially creating weaknesses around their king. Securing the rook on the first rank provides crucial defense against further incursions, while simultaneously preparing to contest the open c-file, a vital pathway for potential counterplay. The bishop retreats, a subtle repositioning that aims to untangle white's pieces after the recent exchange of queens and pawns, creating a more cohesive defensive structure against black's active rook. Sacrificing the bishop to create a passed pawn on the b-file even at the cost of material, fundamentally alters the endgame's complexion, aiming to distract white's remaining pieces and exploit the pawn's eventual advance. A delicate moment unfolds as the rook, freed from its defensive duties on the 7th rank, now eyes the enemy pawn structure with renewed purpose, seeking to infiltrate and destabilize black's pawn chain. The rook's aggressive advance to the 2nd rank immediately eyes the vulnerable b-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay against the enemy king. Securing the rook on the 2nd rank offers the white king crucial escape and prevents further black infiltration, solidifying the position for what appears to be a slow, strategic endgame grind. Bringing the monarch towards the center is a standard endgame principle, aiming to activate it as a fighting piece and support its remaining pawns. Bringing the monarch towards the action now begins a crucial endgame consolidation. Its proximity to the pawns on the kingside offers potential for both defense and future promotion advances, while simultaneously preparing to contest central control. Moving the king to f6 opens up new avenues for the monarch, creating a potentially dynamic endgame where the king becomes an active participant in the play, rather than just a passive defender. The monarch ventures forth from its protective pawn shield, seeking an active role in the unfolding endgame, an aggressive sortie that aims to exploit the opponent's exposed king and control key squares. Introducing some much-needed dynamism into the position, this pawn thrust aims to create counterplay and potentially activate the king. Relocating the monarch to the center is a bold step, seeking to activate it for the coming endgame and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure before it becomes too entrenched. Activating the king is paramount in this simplified material situation, preparing it to support the pawn advance and potentially contest the central files. Solidifying the pawn chain, f3 aims to prevent any immediate disruption to white's king's safety, subtly preparing for a potential future advance that could restrict black's rook's activity. Embracing the pressure, black carves out a promising passed pawn, a testament to their earlier maneuvering and white's pawn structure vulnerabilities. Initiating a coordinated advance of the rooks to create immediate pressure on the queenside pawns, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. The rook's excursion to the queenside, Ra3, actively contests the advanced passed pawn and prevents its immediate march, simultaneously preparing to support a potential pawn advance or to defend against any encroaching enemy pieces. Centralizing the monarch offers a crucial refuge and prepares for potential pawn advances, consolidating the king's position in the shrinking battlefield. A creative attempt to create counterplay on the kingside, aiming to distract white from the advancing passed pawn on the queenside. Navigating this endgame demands meticulous pawn structure management, and this move seeks to solidify your king's safety while preparing to contest the crucial central files. The black rook abandons its post on the 7th rank, a curious choice considering the potential for disruption it held there, and now ventures towards the queenside. This repositioning might be an attempt to solidify the pawn structure or perhaps to prepare for some subtle maneuver, but it feels a bit aimless given white's consolidated position and encroaching king. Pushing this pawn offers a strategic pawn thrust, aiming to create a passed pawn by sacrificing material if black decides to capture it. It's a bold attempt to disrupt black's structure and potentially gain queenside space, but it requires careful calculation to ensure white doesn't overextend or leave critical squares undefended. Harnessing the newfound activity, black's king ventures into the fray, eyeing the weakened light squares and preparing to support the isolated passed pawn. Clearing the central pawn structure opens the path for the rook to become an active participant in the ensuing king hunt, aiming to trap the black monarch. The king embarks on an adventurous foray towards the queenside, hoping to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay, though it exposes him to considerable danger from the centralized white rooks and the looming pawn majority. Unlocking the g-file offers a chance to activate the rook behind the advancing pawn, potentially creating a critical passed pawn on the queenside. The black king, having boldly ventured forward, now finds itself in a precarious position, caught between the advanced white pawns and the watchful enemy rook, demanding immediate attention to its safety, lest it become a target for a devastating attack. Rethinking king's safety now becomes paramount as the opposition is firmly established, forcing the monarch to consider its future well-being rather than merely participating in the pawn race. The black king, now forced to the edge, endeavors to create a passed pawn, but white's rook on b5 aggressively cuts off its escape. Activating the king to support the rook's infiltration is a crucial step as the pawn structure crumbles. A daring attempt to reignite activity on the king side, but it neglects the pressing issue of the passed pawn advancing relentlessly on the queen side. Creating space for the rook on the queen side becomes paramount as we transition into a complex endgame scenario where pawn structure dictates the flow. The rook's assertion of the f-file now presents a significant threat, potentially opening lines towards white's king or creating passed pawns if the opportunity arises. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank instigates a potent pressure campaign, aiming to exploit the exposed king and sever communication between black's remaining pieces. Squeezing the rook to a more active square, this pawn push is designed to liberate the bishop and create potential winning chances by threatening to create a passed pawn on the queen side, forcing white to defend against multiple threats. Pushing the king towards the center opens up crucial tactical possibilities, forcing black to react to the immediate threat and potentially disrupting their coordination. The king's exposed position on the 4th rank, a direct consequence of the rook's foray and the pawn structure's rigidity, becomes the primary target. This check forces the black king out of its relatively safe central position and into a more exposed square, where it can be more easily targeted by white's remaining pieces. The king's journey to the center, a bold maneuver seeking active participation, now faces the looming threat of the rook's relentless pressure along the 7th rank. Forcing the opponent's king further into the corner is a wise tactic, as the open files can soon become dangerous for it. This repeated checking is a desperate attempt to force a draw from a losing position. Black's king, although somewhat exposed, can evade the perpetual threat and solidify its advantage. The king's reign of safety is decisively over. White relentlessly hunts it across the board, forcing it into a perilous dance and opening up new avenues of attack with this timely check. The king's desperate dance continues, searching for safety as the rook bears down on the d-file. Bringing the monarch closer is essential in these types of king and pawn endings, aiming to support the advancing pawns and control crucial squares. Challenging white's passed pawn advance with a capture creates immediate tactical complications and forces a response, potentially disrupting white's structural integrity. Asserting dominance on the open file, this check forces the opponent's king to a less secure square, potentially setting up further threats or tactical opportunities. The rook's advanced position is now truly menacing, threatening to march up the 7th rank and disrupt black's entire structure. Initiating a pawn march with the rook's repositioning is a bold attempt to create a passed pawn threat on the king side, though it leaves the king with fewer defenders. Black's king, having ventured quite far from its initial safety, now finds itself in a precarious position, a target for the encroaching white rook and bishop. This current placement, while seemingly active, opens up lines for swift attacks and could easily lead to a forced retreat or a precarious defense. Clearing the path for the rook to become an active participant in the endgame, this recapture finally simplifies the board. Resignation looms as the black king, exposed and isolated on the king side, becomes a primary target for the encroaching white forces. Solidifying the rook's dominion over the 8th rank, this repositioning ensures it stands ready to exploit any weakness or provide crucial defense should the black king attempt a daring sortie. Forces a material exchange in the rook endgame, aiming to simplify and potentially achieve a draw by perpetual check or create a passed pawn with the remaining pieces. The monarch retreats to a safer square, seeking refuge from potential checks while also opening a path for the rook to potentially join the defense on the king side. The king is momentarily exposed on the open file, demanding immediate attention and forcing a calculated retreat to safety. Cruising towards the promotion square, the white king solidifies its central presence, eyeing potential pawn advances while keeping a watchful eye on the remaining black forces. The black rook's persistent checks aim to disrupt white's coordination and prevent the king from reaching a safer square, forcing white's king into a potentially exposed position by the ongoing pawn push. The white king marches forward, a bold stride to claim its rightful place in the center of this complex endgame, seeking an active role in the battle for pawns and the eventual promotion of its own. Bringing the rook back to the king side, the defender attempts to create a central pawn presence and potentially prepare a pawn push to the fourth rank to hinder the enemy king's mobility, though it risks leaving the king exposed on the final rank to the aggressive white rook. Unleashing a forcing check to dislodge the black king from its precarious central perch, exploiting the open file to create immediate king safety concerns. The king, having danced provocatively close to the enemy, now seeks refuge behind the passed pawn's advance, aiming to solidify its position and prepare for the final push. This rook repositioning prepares to contest the newly opened g-file, aiming to either dislodge the opposing rook or exploit potential weaknesses around black's king. Acknowledging the king's exposed position, black endeavors to shield it further. Securing the central squares with the king is paramount now, preventing black's pawns from advancing further and potentially creating dangerous passers. Black disrupts white's consolidating king position with a check, aiming to maintain any glimmer of counterplay. The king boldly steps out, seeking to cut off the black rook's escape route along the first rank and solidify control of the central squares. The rook's repositioning provides a critical check, forcing the white king into a potentially awkward square and disrupting any immediate plans for king safety or piece development white might have had in mind. Bringing the king forward to support the rook on the seventh rank initiates a delicate dance to unblock the passed pawn, a crucial step in escaping this endgame bind. Seeking to prolong the inevitable, the king valiantly charges into the fray, hoping to create a last-ditch checkmating net, but finds itself desperately exposed to the relentless enemy pressure. Securing the king's escape route, this move redirects the monarch to a safer square, away from immediate discovered checks that black has repeatedly attempted. Unpinning the rook and centralizing it on the seventh rank, the king's defense feels suddenly precarious with that open file. Pushing the h-pawn here aims to create a dangerous passed pawn, potentially leading to a swift victory if black isn't careful about its advance. The pawn on c2, no longer defended by the rook, now faces immediate danger from the marauding rook. The rook now seizes control of the promotion square, a crucial step in its march towards creating a new queen. With the king exposed, black's rook desperately seeks shelter, but this square offers little respite from the oncoming storm. Pushing the pawn forward to h7, white initiates a desperate race to promotion, a last-ditch effort to salvage something from this endgame by creating a new queen before the opponent's king can effectively intervene. Conceding the seventh rank now allows the white rook to become a formidable presence, potentially cutting off the black king's escape routes while simultaneously supporting the passed pawn's advance. The rook's sudden occupation of the open eighth rank exerts immense pressure on the black king, forcing a defensive retreat and exposing the pawn structure. The king ventures out, seeking refuge behind the pawn chain, but this pawn majority now becomes a serious threat on the queen side. Unleashing the king to its full potential, this advance seeks to exploit the recently cleared diagonal and gain a more active post for the monarch.